This week on Mutuality Matters.
So you hear the language of submit as we read it today and go, oh, that sounds really conventional and maybe potentially harmful, some people's experience, right? Um, but that's not the piece that would have surprised anyone reading this text. They would have been surprised by a number of features, including that slaves are addressed for a whole, I think it's 9 verses. I mean, the end of chapter 2 is all theirs. And then 3, 1 through 6, the wives are given, both slaves and wives are given more agency than they're given in Greco-Roman household codes. That in itself should cause us to say, okay, I think I need to learn more about this form that is so prominent in this letter. About a quarter of the letter sits right in the middle of it. Peter's using it as a strategy.
Well, it's my extreme pleasure to welcome all of you to CBE's podcast, Mutuality Matters. Thank you for joining us as we explore women in words, Bible translation, and interpretation, why it matters. I'm very thankful to have as our guest today, Dr. Jeannine Brown. Welcome, Jeannine.
Good to be with you.
And also a dear colleague, Dr. Charel Detoit, who's been with CBE for over a year and has recently completed his PhD in New Testament. Welcome to you, Charel.
Thank you so much. Glad to be here.
Okay, so Charel, how would you like to read this passage? 1 Peter. This will be a focus for this discussion.
Thank you. Yeah, let's start by reading 1 Peter 3, verse 1 to 7, reading out of the NIV. Starting at verse 1, wives, in the same way, submit yourselves to your own husbands, so that if any of them do not believe the word, they may be won over without words by the behavior of their wives, when they see the purity and reverence of your lives. Your beauty should not come from outward adornment, such as elaborate hairstyles and the wearing of gold jewelry or fine clothes. Rather, it should be that of your inner self, the unfading beauty of a gentle and quiet spirit, which is of great worth in God's sight. For this is the way the holy women of the past, who put their hope in God, used to adorn themselves. They submitted themselves to their own husbands, like Sarah, who obeyed Abram and called him her Lord. You are her daughters, if you do what is right and do not give way to fear. Husbands, in the same way, be considerate as you live with your wives, and treat them with respect as the weaker partner and as heirs with you of the gracious gift of life, so that nothing will hinder your prayers.
Well, thank you. Well, Jeannine, over to you. What are your thoughts on the cultural background of this passage? And how does knowing history help us in interpreting it well as it relates to the statements on husbands and wives?
In my reading of First Peter, it's as with other New Testament texts, it's really crucial that we hear the text in its original first context, that first century world, first century Greco-Roman world, the Jewish strains that are really important for the Gospels, but for the whole of the New Testament, we hear the whole text in that original context. That's the goal of strong interpretation. And there are a number of things that are important when we come to First Peter 3 to already realize that we are smack dab in the middle of a household code, which is a form of writing. It's a literary form in the ancient world, in Greek thought originally, and it carried over into Roman sort of moral discourse, the discussion of what's right and good for society. So we have Aristotle and Plato both using various household codes, using the household code to shore up allegiance within the state, to make for good citizens. If you're a good citizen in the household, you'll be a good citizen in the state. Those were always linked very closely. And you might say, well, Plato and Aristotle lived a little bit before the time of the New Testament, but in the early Roman, so right before the first century, right around that time, Roman interest in these household codes really spiked. David Balch in his work suggests that there were handbooks that this material was saved and repeated in, so that Romans could also benefit from this strong sense of a connection between obedience, faithfulness in the household to faithfulness in the state. And the Romans were quite interested in keeping things tamped down amongst all the peoples they had occupied. So you have this household code, which has a particular form to it. And we start in First Peter in chapter 2, verse 11, in this household code. You hear it, this introduction to 11 through 12, but also 2:13. All people are to submit, and the first language of submit in the household code comes there in 2:13. Submit to governing authorities, emperor, governors. But then in 2:18, we hear that household slaves are also to submit. And then in 3:1, wives are to submit. And then in 3:7, husbands are to live in a way that recognizes something about their wife. This is a household code. And to know that in the household code, most of the time, it is the head of the household, the male head of the household, that is addressed. Notice when that person is addressed in this Petrine household code. 3:7, last verse, one verse. Majority of space is given to slaves who routinely are not addressed at all in household codes. And then to wives who, if they're addressed, they're told, follow your husband, obey your husband, pay attention to what your husband wants. So you hear the language of submit as we read it today and go, oh, that sounds really conventional and maybe potentially harmful, some people's experience, right? But that's not the piece that would have surprised anyone reading this text. They would have been surprised by a number of features, including that slaves are addressed for a whole, I think it's 9 verses. I mean, the end of chapter 2 is all theirs. And then 3:1 through 6, the wives are given, both slaves and wives are given more agency than they're given in Greco-Roman household codes. That in itself should cause us to say, okay, I think I need to learn more about this form that is so prominent in this letter. About a quarter of the letter sits right in the middle of it. Peter's using it as a strategy, but he's not using it to just say, stay put and do just what the Greeks and Romans thought you should do. That is not at all, I think, what's going on. So I would say that helps us get a bigger picture. But then as we move into the very first verse in 3:1, wives in the same way as slaves were mentioned earlier, submit yourselves to your own husbands, so that if any of them do not believe the word, that's a way of talking about believing the gospel, they're not Christians, they may be won over without words by the behavior of their wives. They may be won over. This is a really missional moment in the letter. It's probably the most missional moment we've heard so far in the letter. What it has in common with 2:18 and the conversation with slaves is that Peter is highlighting for slaves and then wives who are living in divided households. It's not that every wife and slave didn't have a Christian master, but he's highlighting those that don't. This is such a precarious place to be in the first century world. To be in a household where your husband follows the ancestral gods, goes to the imperial cult, goes to the emperor cult, and expects you to do the same, is a really tricky situation. There's a great line in Plutarch in his advice to brides and grooms. He says something like, and wives, you are to have the friends that your husband has. Your husband's friends are to be your friends. And first among the friends are the gods. Therefore, you're not to have any gods apart from the ones your husband has. Wow. Put that behind the text and go, okay, you hear something a bit different, right? What does Peter say? Don't follow your husband's gods. Don't return. Don't capitulate. You are wives who follow Jesus the Messiah. Look ahead at 3:15. You call Messiah, Jesus the Messiah, Lord. That's your claim. Do not go back on that. You might win your husband by submitting, by doing the thing expected of you in this cultural context, and by actually not saying a word. I mean, let your behavior lead the way, because you are in a precarious situation. And my desire for you is that you would win your husband to Jesus. Wow, that's different than I heard that verse growing up. I'm just going to say it. So I'm going to stop there for a minute, because that's kind of I think it has quite a different cast when we hear it with that background and go, oh, they're to stay true to Jesus. And that's not an easy or a safe thing to do necessarily.
very
Mm.
missional. It's sort of a missional posture.
Very much so.
Yeah, that's very awesome. I love also the mention that you make of the slaves, and the addressing to the slaves. I think often also we can visualize thinking of the first century. Slaves are also women. They're also female slaves
Yes,
being
women
addressed.
and men, right? And they're
Yeah.
easily abused because, as Aristotle
Mm,
said, slaves are just living tools. That's all
yeah,
they are.
yeah.
So there were certainly some slave holders in the first century world who were kinder than others. You know, in other words, if you look at moral discourse, again, kind of what Greek and Roman elite men say about this whole thing, you should treat your slaves fairly well. That doesn't
Mm,
mean people did it. And that doesn't mean they didn't allow for punishment that was abusive. Look at beating 218, 219, very real possibility. Because
yeah.
in 218, we hear slaves in reverent fear of God, submit yourselves to your masters, not only to those who are good and considerate or tolerant,
Yeah.
tolerant of your faith, but also to those who are harsh. I mean, they're just sitting between a rock and a hard place. That's what I think. If you're a
Yeah.
Christian slave and you're not allowed to choose,
Mm,
Peter's giving them moral agency, which
mhm.
is
Mm.
pretty pretty striking in household code terms.
Yeah, yeah, that's incredible. When you talk about the household codes and the ones you specifically now that you're discussing, how do you think we should understand Peter's use of these household codes? Like, how do you think the wives received this
Mm.
when he addressed the church?
Yeah, it's a great question. And I like to think of wives whose husbands are not followers of Jesus, and also wives whose husbands are. The
Mm,
husbands that are addressed in 3:7, right? And I think both sets will hear this sort of heightened agency. I get to stay true to Jesus as a really empowering moment in a really difficult situation. So the submission that's called for, and then the what we hear in verses 2 and 3 about their inward beauty versus outward adornment, these are really conventional moral categories and exhortations in that first century Greco-Roman world. These are, I mean, this wouldn't be surprising stuff. I call it the unmarked part of the household code.
Right.
It's not
yeah,
marked because you just don't, it's not pressing at you. The marked stuff is you'll win them over. And
mm,
another marked moment is when we get to verse 6, and you're going to be Sarah's children if you do what is right, theme across the letter, do what is right so that nobody can accuse you in the end, even though the people are going to accuse you. It's one of those things. If you do what is right and do not give way to fear. Peter uses here the word phobeo, to fear, sometimes to revere, but in this case, to fear. And then he uses a strong word for like intimidation. And he puts those together to say to not fear any intimidation or to give way to fear or to fear any terror. I mean, it could be that strong. So
yeah,
what's most likely going to be the intimidation in their context if they have a husband who does not follow Jesus? It's going to be his pressure to return to the family gods, to return to the temple that we go to routinely, and she's not comfortable doing that. To offer at the in the home at the statue of an altar to offer something right there. I mean, she's not comfortable doing that, but the intimidation is to do that, to do those things that honor our family and honor our city and honor the gods. It's offense to the gods to follow Jesus. I mean,
mm,
there's a reason early Christians were thought to be atheists because they were ignoring the gods.
Right.
mm,
It's
Right.
fine to add, it's fine to add something to that pantheon of gods you pay attention to. Not every person pay attention to all gods, but you have your kind of your few sort of your gods, and she's ignoring those. She's in his mind ignoring those. So that's probably the source of intimidation. I mean, that's the most likely. And he says, and Peter says, don't give way to fear, that kind of don't give way to fear and that kind of intimidation. Stand firm,
Yeah.
stand firm, which is what he'll say almost immediately after that in 3:15 and 16. Revere, set apart, Christ as Lord in your hearts, always being prepared to give an answer. Although the wives are told, careful about that answer, make it a sort of a behavioral answer.
Yeah, yeah.
But do it with gentleness and respect. They're walking such a fine line. All of the believers in these audiences, I think Peter's writing to people who are walking this fine line and, trying to figure out how to live in society but yet not capitulate and return to idolatry. And these wives and slaves are in particularly precarious places.
Well, and it's particularly precarious to people today in many places.
As much as this situation is mirrored in contexts, in terms of women having less choice, less agency, it can play out very similarly, can't it?
Yeah, please.
I was just going to say, I don't know if Dreamgirls, the musical Dreamgirls, is a wonderful musical. And Dina, later in the musical, talks about she has an abusive husband. He's emotionally abusive, controlling. And she has this line in a song called, I forget what the song is called, but the line is, "I am not home in my own home." And I was just struck by that. I think that reality of people not home in their own, and people have that today, right?
Right.
They have that experience. And that's what some of these women were experiencing. And so I think about back to your question of what are some of the other women potentially hearing as well? They're hearing that we support those who are going to be in these precarious situations. There's kind of this communal awareness that gets raised by Peter's rhetorical discourse.
But Jeannine, even for Christians today, there's a sense in which culture is a place where we're not truly at home.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think depending if which places we are in, so time and place makes a difference.
What do you think is often missed by readers that read this passage in 1 Peter today, especially readers that support patriarchal worldviews or authority leadership in their homes? How do you think they read this passage in unhelpful ways?
Often for me, readings that don't take full account of the whole of a work, here the whole letter, that it's easy to pull something out, right? And in our tradition of preaching, and also the tradition of my guild, biblical studies, we like little pieces, like you do your dissertation on a couple verses, right? I mean that has been sort of a tendency. And one of I come out of I'm a product of narrative criticism, which is narrative analysis of Gospels and Acts. And one of the things that's slowly honed in me is this idea that I need to grapple with a whole text, whether it's First Timothy or Matthew, where I did my dissertation. First Peter, I'm writing a commentary for the New International Commentary on the New Testament. In First Peter, I have to grapple with the whole, and I have to grapple with the whole in its first century context for the New Testament. That doesn't mean I'm going to fully understand it. It doesn't mean I'm not going to have to make some historical assumptions or, to do some guesswork, you have to do some spade work, and we're not always sure exactly what to put behind a text. But I tell my students, you will always put a context behind a text every time. You'll put your own if you don't think about it much. Or you might think about, oh no, I think the situation is a bit different for the Philippians in the letter to the Philippians, or in First Peter. So I think the mistakes we make are often that we are not reading the whole. We're just atomizing a text, pulling something out, whether a verse or 5 verses or whatever it is, and then we're not hearing it as best we can against that original context. So, and I think here in First Peter, one of the most troublesome things in scholarly work is if people aren't recognizing this is a household code. I mean, just to recognize the form of it. Okay, so I wrote a book that was published last year called Embedded Genres in the New Testament, kind of a mouthful and not terribly jazzy title, but it came out of some lectures I did. And one of the lectures was, and so one of the chapters is on the household code in First Peter. Why put a household code in the middle of a letter? That's the title of my chapter. And that was so, I mean, I'd already done some work on that and I'd already taught my students some of that, but doing that additional work was like, oh my goodness, this is hugely important for understanding First Peter. If we say there's no household code, which at least one commentator has said, it really is not, it's not close enough to that form. I'm like, it is. And what's being done to this traditional form bends in the direction of giving agency to those that are most vulnerable, wives and slaves. So bending in the direction of more agency, more power, more egalitarian impulse. You know, is First Peter egalitarian? I mean, that language is hard to kind of just plop on a first century text, but is there this egalitarian impulse? Absolutely. The way the form that is standard has a standard set of parameters to it, the way it's being used pushes in the direction of equality and lifting up those most vulnerable. That's what I love about the household code of First Peter. It's like the vulnerable ones are given, like the slaves, the most vulnerable ones. Who gets Jesus? Who gets Jesus in 21 through 25, following in his footsteps? The slaves get Jesus. We get to listen in, and I think Peter would want to say this is for you too, but he gives it to the slaves in the household code. It's in that part that's to the slaves. They get Jesus because those people need Jesus.
It's beautiful. So in conversations with your complementarian friends and colleagues, how would you know, what progress have you seen in growing and expanding the conversation in light of your comments earlier that this is a household code placed in the middle of a difficult socio context?
Exactly.
And yet here we have these liberating elements and notes that are surprising if you are fully complementarian.
Yes. And I love the way you put that. It's a great question. I think one question I ask, and it's a true question because I see it routinely, is that people who come to these kinds of texts, they want to think about faithfully applying, and they on the way through from text to application, they make some moves, whether they're paying attention to them or not. So I want to ask them about the moves they make, and it's easier to do it with 2:18 through 25 and say, so how do you apply Peter's words to household slaves today?
Yeah.
And sometimes, I mean, I remember when I was working on my book Scriptures Communication, I was in the UK, and 2 Sundays in a row, they weren't liturgical context, so it wasn't about the readings for the week or whatever. 2 Sundays in a row, I heard sermons on Ephesians 6, so about slaves and masters, and really quickly the move to say this is, you know, about employers, employees. I'm like, is it? Is that really what it's about? This is very different. If you own somebody, you may, you know, you could use that as a metaphor for how you feel about work some days. I understand, but you are not owned by somebody. You don't live in their household, and the very food you have is, you know, based on their beneficence. You know, I mean, it's like, no, these are not, and this is a household phenomenon, which isn't the way employee typically works, though after COVID now, I mean, I guess I'm working from home more, whatever. To ask the question, to say, how did you make that translation? Might there be a different kind of translation we need to hear if we really listen to what first century slavery is about? You know, it's so asking about the sort of the analogy that they're using, because we apply using analogies often, right? So, and you could say, well, then they would say, hey, well, so there's no slavery today. Well, you know, but we would like to think there's no slavery around the world today. There's no slavery today, but there is marriage. I'm like, well, that would be the wrong that would be the wrong set of analogies. It's not about slavery and marriage, it's about slavery and patriarchy. Those are the comparable pieces we hear. So thinking about if we live in a context where marriage is fairly egalitarian, US, you know, then to take something that actually moves against the purposes of the text, and that's a key question for me when I apply or recontextualize the text. What are the purposes of the text? If Peter's taking a household code and bending it in the direction of more agency for those who are vulnerable, we could say an egalitarian impulse at various points, then what in the world are we doing by moving it backwards, taking something in our context where women already sometimes have more agency, not always, you know, really want to recognize the differences amongst women in my own US context. And then what are we doing it and going sort of the other direction? Honoring the purposes of an author are really important. The direction that they're moving with something, or the ways they're using a traditional form like this. That's to me really important. So that's a conversation I'd like to have with people. And we could do the same thing with 2:13 through 17, where the Petrine believers are to submit themselves to the emperor, and yet only honor the emperor and not fear or revere the emperor. 2:17, there's some ways that Peter takes the emperor down a peg, a few ways. Now, first of all, he's a human authority. He's not a divine authority, which is what Caesar claimed, right? So he's doing some things already. And to say, well, that's just about, how we submit to the governing authorities. Well, I mean, let's think about it more deeply. Let's think about what Peter's saying. He's pressing against some of the idolatrous ways the emperors looked at in the first century world. And then let's think about that today then. How do we engage as political beings with a vote? That wasn't the case in the ancient world. Noticing what's the same and what's different is really important in applying. And we sometimes do it kind of off the cuff fairly well. And other times we just aren't paying attention to how different a situation is as we move from first century world to 21st century, whatever context we're in.
Yeah.
Recognizing other people are in very contexts might be much more similar to First Peter around the world.
Saying that just real quickly reminds me of this book that Gordon Fee wrote about tracing the spirit in the text, because it just illustrates what you're saying, that there's this movement of the spirit counterculturally calling forth virtue and courage, don't fear, in believers who have to see the world as temporal.
Yeah. Well, and Fee is one of my favorite persons to go to talk about that whole recontextualization, because he thought about that really carefully. He didn't just presume that we have to reinstantiate ancient Greco-Roman norms. You know what I mean? He thought about what does it look like to pay attention to what the authors of scripture are saying. That's a different question than just simply reinstating ancient world today.
Well,
none of us are trying to do that.
Well, and for Fee, it was a living spirit in the text speaking to us, both in the first century and now. And he, I think, saw the continuity of God's spirit in speaking to us through those ancient stories. So that was beautiful.
Yeah.
I'm also if I can jump in, I'm curious to, I love obviously context being incredibly important, and you're touching on anachronism, ethnocentrism that sometimes happens through our interpretation and our translations of the text. I had an old professor that said, if you take the text out of context, you're left with a con, which I always thought was pretty a catchy way to put it. I'm fascinated about how you think headings influences that, because the ancient texts don't have headings, but we have headings at the beginning of our text, and that kind of primes us to search for something in this passage or to think in a certain way. You think like this, like headings at the beginning of, and it'll be different, I think, in the NIV or the American Standard Version.
Oh, it is very much so, right? Yeah, that's really what I'm just looking at my NIV, and the heading starts at the beginning of the household code. Yay, us. I'm on the NIV team. So, I didn't make that happen, but it's preceded me, I think. But living godly lives in a pagan society. And it's 2:11 all the way through 3:7. So they make you look at it all together. They don't start a new heading at 3:1. It's a new paragraph, which makes sense, but there's not a new heading. So, but yes, I do. I think those kinds of things make a difference, and in translation as well. Just even kind of points like that. For us, we actually vote for the NIV team. We vote on headings, and they're under our purview. Footnotes are ours. Cross references no, but footnotes are ours, and headings. So we routinely talk about those kinds of things. And for us, headings are meant to help a reader move through the text, and kind of have a little bit of the content of what comes next. But they look different in NIV in the Gospels versus here as well. The Gospels, we tend to have them more frequently because of the pericopes. We tend to follow those. It's an inexact thing that headings are. But I'm really glad that you raised it, because I like that we don't separate off 3 or 2:18 from, that we see this as a whole, which I think is really important.
Yeah, thank you. Beautiful. Well, we're going to take a break, and we'll be back to hear some more from Jeannine and Charel. So stay tuned, everyone.
Mutuality Matters podcast, along with thousands of CBE's other resources and content, is available for free on CBE's website, which is possible because of donor support. Together, we can spread the message that God calls women and men of all cultures, races, and classes to share authority equally in service and in leadership in the home, church, and world. Give today at cbe.today/donate.
Going to 1 Peter 3:7, verse 7, husbands, in the same way, be considerate as you live with your wives and treat them with respect as the weaker partner and as heirs with you of the gracious gift of life, so that nothing will hinder your prayers. Okay, Charel.
Yeah. So if we read this text, thanks, Mimi, for that. If we read this text, 1 Peter 3, verse 7, and it turns to the husbands, and it instructs them to live with understanding and honor their wives. Can you, Jeannine, can you add some texture, insight, further explanation to this? What do you think Peter is emphasizing through these verses?
I think it's helpful first to note that here's the final verse. I mean, it's it's got some heft to it. It says a few different things, but it's one verse for husbands, and it's been quite a long exhortation for wives and for slaves even longer, so that this is unusual in terms of who's addressed. In the ancient context, in the household code, it's primarily the paterfamilias, that's the Roman, the Latin term for the head of household, that's being addressed, because they're the one is in charge and takes charge and makes sure everything runs in their household well, and make sure that those that are subordinate pay attention to what he says. So here we have it at the end. It's short. And I'm sorry, I shouldn't say I love it, but I love that it ends with a warning. It's the only person in the household who's warned of anything in the entire household code, so that nothing will hinder your prayers. I mean, that's a warning, right? You want to have your prayers go to the ceiling and stop? Okay, then you dishonor your wife, and that's what's going to happen. I will not be listening. And the beautiful conclusion to the household code, the final this is a concluding section 8 through 12, cites quite extensively Psalm 34, which says, the eyes of the Lord are on the righteous, and his ears are attentive to their prayer. That's very intentionally a connection there.
Yeah.
So you want your prayers to go somewhere. And I think these are the husband's prayers. I mean, you could say, some say, well, these are the prayers of the husband and wife together. I think this is spoken to the husband, and it's like his prayers, your meaning plural, all you husbands, versus plural, your husband and wife together. So nothing will hinder your prayers. I mean, that's quite powerful. So what does Peter say to the husbands? It's kind of a grammatical mess. It's not a mess in that he made a mess. It's that we don't know exactly how to parse out exactly which part goes exactly with which part. But I do think either way you go, the NIV gets at the idea that it's about living in a way that's considerate of who your wife is. And there are a couple things he wants them to know about that. One is that you are to assign them honor, give them respect, treat them with respect. The honor language is so powerful in the discourse around first century, the first century world at present. There's a lot of books that have honor, shame in them. So I like to highlight this it's respect, but honor to me seems like a stronger word, and that it is tame. It is the language of giving honor. And in the ancient world, you tend to give honor upward and you get favors downward. In other words, in the pyramid of life, those at the top provide for, give gifts, feed, take care of those lower in rank that they're connected to. The people lower in rank give honor upward. That's what you do. You give honor that direction. Now, in the pyramid where the husbands are above the wives in the Greco-Roman world, now you're to assign them honor. Now, there is a kind of a very complex thing that goes on with honor within a family, of course. We share honor, right? In a family, you share honor. So there's some of that shared honor. But this is somewhat unusual to hear this language of honor your wife. I think it's Philo. The Jewish writer Philo talks about how the wife is worthy of less honor than her husband. I mean, she has a line about that. So we shouldn't just bypass this really quickly to say assign honor is to really mix up this kind of hierarchical structure that they're all in. As the weaker partner, we can talk about that in a moment, and as heirs, this is the co-heirs language. As co-heirs of, so heirs with you is the idea, co-heirs of the gracious gift, which is life. I think life itself is the gift. So you're co-heirs of God's gift of life to you. You both share that. And that's important to hear because that's not given again in the ancient world. They share together. There's not a one above the other in the gifting of life that God has given. He's given it to both, and that's important.
Yeah.
So that's just a start with some of that texture you were talking about. There's more to talk about, though, I'm sure.
Yeah. Well, okay, so now to the weaker vessels.
Yes.
What are your
Is that
thoughts?
my question? Okay. Yes. The language, you're right. I mean, it's traditionally been translated as vessel, skeuos, which can refer to, like in First Thessalonians, one's body or maybe your spouse's body, you know, kind of in that context, there's a question mark there. It can also be used to emphasize kind of the use in a particular context. So is it that he's talking about the weaker partner in the household? That's one possibility. So that it's the one with less power,
Yeah.
more vulnerable. I think, I mean, across many ancient authors, certainly the woman was spoken of as physically weaker as well, which of course made her more socially vulnerable. I mean, we know that that connection is there. So I tend to hear it as social and physical, with those two not being not connected. So those two being connected, you know, that the one makes her more vulnerable within the household. So how do you translate that? I mean, vessel I find not terribly helpful. You're not going to see that in the NIV as in terms of a person. Weaker partner, I think that's a tricky one to try to communicate. That's where you need a little commentary, right? To talk about what does that mean and what does it sound like in that first context?
Well, I mean, I've heard it interpreted to mean that the woman is ontologically morally inferior, and that's where headship is necessary because men are, by contrast, morally less inferior. So that she's the temptress. It was Eve who led Adam astray.
Yeah,
and
that's
so
a lot too important to this verse. I mean, I hear you saying, of course, you're implying that as well.
well, no, this is where I think a lot of people enter CBE, for example, having heard this and really internalized it.
Yeah, yeah.
And I don't think it's a stretch to say that this is what many churches teach.
Yeah. Well, and they'd have good company in ancient Greco-Roman discourse that some authors might push in that direction, right? The moral inferiority or the like you say, ontological inferiority of the woman in the relationship. But that's not, I don't think that's easily derived from the Old Testament or certainly not from the New Testament either. In other words, in Jewish thought, this is harder to come by.
Not in Greco-Roman thought.
Right. And maybe you could say later rabbis, I'm not an expert in that area, but in terms of the New Testament and what we hear in the Old Testament, there doesn't feel like there's justification for that kind of reading.
No, but it does smack of, what's going on in its challenge to the culture of the time.
Yeah.
This weaker vessel language.
Yeah, I appreciate Craig Keener's, in his First Peter commentary, he talks about this is the more vulnerable member of the household.
Yeah.
That he's hearing that language here. I think I would also hear physically weaker, which then puts a person in a more vulnerable spot in these contexts. So
Right.
yeah, that's where I lean. But you're right. I mean, I don't hear, especially because co-heirs comes right after it.
Yeah.
To hear sort of some moral inferiority or some sort of she needs taking care of because she'll never quite be an adult. That kind of infantilizing that happens. I've experienced that in my own experience, my career. It's like, well, you could let me grow up at some point. I'm over 40, goodness sakes.
Well, and that the perfect human in Roman culture, was physical and
Yes.
exercised in the
The male
Colosseum.
adult, right?
Yeah.
Male adult is the
Yeah.
perfect specimen, right? So women are by nature deficient. Yes. Yeah. So I don't think that's what's going on here, but it's not pressing against something really directly. I think the language of co-heirs helps us to hear, oh, this is
Good point.
different
Yeah.
than that.
Good point. Yeah,
yeah.
helpful.
And specifically with the co-heirs, and speaking about co-heirs, that might not be something that's that unusual for an audience today, necessarily to hear when they think about heirs. But how would that have been different to a first century audience or a second probably century audience listening to the text or hearing to it and hearing this talk about co-heirs? How would that have been different? How we
Because
interpret
males were heirs. I mean, they were the ones that got the estate. So putting this equal kind of footing, heirs on equal footing. It is a single word that has that co-idea in it, soon inheritance. And I think that really presses at that kind of idea of there's this, again, hierarchy of even inheritance. That, sometimes in Pauline texts around adoption, we will, the adoption to sonship, because in that context, sons received inheritance. So if you're adopted, you can then get as a man, you can get the inheritance. It's not that women got no inheritance. It's just they were different kind of standards. There was an increasing amount of sort of freedom or movement toward inheritance rights for women, especially in a Roman context, I believe. This is not my area of expertise. But in terms of what the standard thinking, to be a co-heir, women, men, that was not a usual way of thinking of things, especially in the Greco-Roman world. So to hear that is quite powerful. One of the things I've been looking at across First Peter, just for a chapter I'm working on, the family metaphors in First Peter. Lots of family metaphors: children, father, breastfeeding image, chapter 2, verse 2. I mean, just all sorts of stuff about God, how God gives life and sustains. One thing I'm very aware of is that the children, the sibling language and the children language is all very kind of equal.
Mm-hmm.
So nobody is called a father except for God. And again, there's this language of craving the milk that will make you grow. I mean, so there's this language that would evoke more of a sort of a mother picture as well. So but nobody in the community is called father. Richard Bauckham notes this across sort of the New Testament, how language of father is sort of denied the Christian community, people in the Christian community. Because it has the paterfamilias idea behind it. And so it has this very, very hierarchical picture. And that's exactly what we don't have in New Testament texts, including First Peter. It's like you're equal siblings. You're on the same train. You're co-heirs of the gift of life. You all have an inheritance, 1 verse 4. There's nothing, even at the end of the letter, where you have the elders and the youngers, the older ones and the younger ones, which I think has some leadership kind of structure to it, very loose. It's like, well, you're going to have some people who lead, and they're going to be the older ones because they're the wiser ones in that context. Wish it were so today. I mean, I wish it were viewed that way today, but not so much. But but even then it's very much, but you're all to be facing each other in humility. So there's just this kind of really powerful egalitarian impulse across the New Testament related to how we are to be with one another. We have, God is a father of our Lord Jesus Christ, and then we are in the Messiah, and we are all siblings. And it's just like brothers and sisters, siblings. And it's this kind of co-heir thing is just shocked through the New Testament. And we are prone to just go to a few texts and say, oh, no, here's the leadership structure. Here, I think we just love leadership structure. It's not, I mean, I'm in a leadership structure. I'm in academia. There's a lot of leadership structure in the, but how we function with one another, how we live in community, it's just got to be this, we're siblings. One is not better than the other. So I just think I hear some of that in this co-heir language is really powerful, and we zip by it so fast, right?
Oh yeah, heirs together.
Yes, yes, we will
Where,
all inherit, and against this backdrop of not everyone inherits equally.
yeah, and not only they don't inherit, they have little agency over their own daily life.
Yeah,
So,
or their money,
oh,
even
right,
in a
their
woman in a wealthy
decisions.
context, yeah, does she get to how much does she get to decide what is? So this is
Right.
quite powerful language.
Yeah, excellent. Thank you. Oh, this is too fun.
It
Well, in
is.
what
It is.
so in what ways does this teaching from Peter can shape our views of marriage that are truly, as you say, I think egalitarian, we're siblings in Christ. We're
Yeah.
co-heirs with the Lord, and he lived to give us this amazing gift through the
Mhm.
sacrifice of Calvary.
Yeah. Again, if we're looking at the whole of the letter and saying, here's a household code and here's how it's been bent, turned in this other, used in this different direction than would be expected. Then I find it hard to say this is just supposed to, we're supposed to erect these walls, enact these kinds of strictures on the church today. It doesn't make sense given the way the text is framed, given what Peter is doing. And again, I raise that family kind of set of family metaphors across the text. So we hear in 122 and following to love earnestly and to love the family of believers. 2:17 is kind of this the siblings, that we have that kind of status. None of us have this higher rank. And even the elders in chapter 5 are a group, and they are the ones that have the wisdom of the community and would lead, but need to lead by example. I mean, even the things they're told there are things that press toward downward mobility. And some people like to talk about Jesus in Philippians 2 as downward mobility. So we have those impulses in the text. So to say now this is to keep things really, really clear. So we have a leader on top, that's a husband, and then a wife below. And that will make sure everything is really, then we don't have any problems with making decisions or whatever it is that kind of swirls around thinking that we need that. That question of is that Peter's intention? As he thinks about his own context, he's trying to, one of my colleagues recently said, what you have in the household code in First Peter is not a prescription, but a triage. I thought, oh, that's powerful. This is Gar Anderson. Not a prescription, but a triage.
And explain what you mean by that. So not everyone.
So a prescription means here's how we should set everything up so that it's really clear that the men are on top and the women and the wives are below, and that the masters are on top and the slaves are below, that the emperor's at the top and everybody else is below. That this is not trying to set up something. This is trying to react to a situation already in motion. And it's a difficult situation. It's a triage situation. Here's what Peter's going to do. Go ahead.
So triage meaning sort of a healing, a pathway to redemption, a pathway for.
It's what you do when there's an emergency.
Oh,
so yeah, triage. Yeah. You go into a hospital and they triage you. It's like, that's the worst person. They get treated first. Here's the next person. They get treated next. And so I'm using it in the hospital context. It's like, this is an emergency and we need something to help this community survive. Shively Smith in her book, From Strangers to Family on First Peter, talks about this is not about reprisal, Christians, trying to pay back. It's about survival. It's about, for the most vulnerable, that they would survive these situations. It's that dire. So in that kind of situation, to set this up as, okay, this is all about setting up really, really clear lines and having make sure, it feels like, wait, we're using the text in a way that Peter would go, I don't think you're recognizing exactly what I was attempting to do here with this long household code, where I was trying to protect the most vulnerable in the community because they were so at risk.
Well, and the Romans tossed them over the walls if, it doesn't look very strong. I mean, they were truly vulnerable.
Yeah.
Have you read that book by has anyone read that book by Tom Holland, Dominion? He's historian of early centuries from Oxford, and this book makes it so visibly clear, so visceral, you just can barely go to the next chapter. The kind of vulnerability people faced in Roman culture. It's just
and in the ancient world generally, but yes, the Romans were not. They were known for their high control and taking care of business, taking care of things that were out of line. Yeah.
Well, actually, in light of his book and these comments, it truly was a triage.
Yeah. So I feel like that helps us to go, okay, then we need to hear the thrust of the text, which is about being attentive to the most vulnerable. And also, I mean, the major theme which the text helps us with is to think about how is it we pursue good, even if somebody comes at us for doing so, and how do we make sure that it is for doing good that we're suffering? That's a question that Peter asks throughout in different ways. He'll say in 3:13, for example, who's going to harm you if you're eager to do good? Think about it. He asks the question to help you think, oh, well, and then, but even if you should suffer, and he uses an optative there, which is this iffy kind of if, even if you should suffer you're blessed, but set apart Christ as Lord in your heart, but keeping a clear conscience so that those who speak maliciously against your good behavior in Christ, your good behavior in Christ, might be ashamed for their slander. The only reason we should ever suffer is our good behavior in the Messiah, which is, I think, not this category that involves everything, but it involves what is it that maintains my loyalty to Jesus, the Messiah? Jesus is Lord. How do I live that way? And the ways I'm living that way, if I get flack, okay. But I have to always ask myself, was that because I was a jerk, or was that because I was staying true to Jesus? And those aren't the same thing. And we often confuse those. I'm just saying, I've seen them confused many a time. Let's not do that. Let's think, how do we remain true to Jesus? And that's not always just a moral set of categories. It's about an allegiance. How do I stay true to Jesus in the midst of a world that isn't seeking to stay true to Jesus?
And if you are maligned maliciously, and you're right, you have to figure out if you deserved it or not. But if you are maligned maliciously and slattered maliciously, usually by people who you love and trust, that's just a really deep wound. And so
really
I think
painful.
Oh my goodness, yeah. And I think this text, I think many people encounter that, leaders especially. And I think if you encounter that, this text is such balm to those wounds, because I'm presuming it's very common. I mean, it's what happens.
And he frames it that if you're suffering because you've been true to Jesus, then you're sharing in Jesus's sufferings in a way that means you'll share in his glory. So there's this lovely promise for restoration that will come, and vindication, if we are suffering for Jesus, truly.
So the heart of the message in the text is actually incredibly powerful and transcendent in that way. Saying that, do you think that the text has been interpreted or translated responsibly, accurately in the past? Do you think there's a translation that does it best? You think we're doing a good job at it?
Yeah, and as somebody who translates, and always knows that nobody's going to ever it's like, what do they say? Translators are traitors. That's the Italian frame. It's just like you can't win. I think different translations do different parts of First Peter better than others, and the NIV isn't perfect. I mean, we are in the process of a canonical review. The NIV has a standing committee, has always had a standing committee for translation. So we meet every year. They started way back in 1984, meeting every year to just presume that language is going to change and we're going to learn new things. And there's going to be new discoveries. And so we will need to always have a text that's, changed. I mean, we have an update, a revision. So we're in the midst of that. We've been doing that since 2011 when the last one came out. And we just have gone through a canonical review. So we've just last year and this year brought, some people brought some First Peter proposals. As you might suspect, I brought a few. But as I was reading through it, I was like, this is really kind of good. Karen Jobs is on the team. I can tell Karen Jobs is on the team. Yay. I mean, there was just some good work done, and, we're kind of fine tuning. And it is the case that something I might want to see at some point. I mean, I'm going to have to convince 10 other people because we have a very, our voting policy is very conservative in that we don't just change the text willy-nilly back and forth. It's got to have a supermajority, kind of a 75% or so. It's like 11 out of 15 members. So I need to have a compelling case to change something. So I think for First Peter and for really, quite frankly, the New Testament generally, it's really helpful for people to not only rely on a translation. I mean, certainly a couple translations, you can see differences. That's a really helpful move. Think about it and don't think, okay, which one do I like better?
Yeah.
Think about which one is more likely to have been what Peter wrote. And how do I know that? Well, I might go to look at a commentary or two or a study Bible, depending on kind of your comfort level with the text. I'm talking not to you two, but to, anybody who's listening. Maybe it's a study Bible, maybe it's a short commentary, the Pillar series or different kinds of series that you make access pretty easily.
A podcast like this, maybe also.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And listen to some different views on. So I think the translation can't do everything because a translation needs to reflect that, that it's written in that time period, so the weaker vessel. So we can't kind of give a whole list of possibilities, weaker this way, but not this way. And that's a commentary. That's work of a commentary or study Bible. So the translation needs to be close enough so people can go, oh, I wonder how that would have struck an early reader, the first readers, whatever it is. We have to go with that as translators.
Yeah.
Especially for something like a media translation like the NIV, the Message, or which is not a translation, or NLT does a little more interpretive language.
Or the Message.
Yeah, right. So then, and we all use interpretive language, but they like the example in the NLT is a despised tax collector. So to help people know that, oh, that's a category that despised tax. Okay.
Yeah.
Most translations don't do that. I like the NLT for all sorts of reasons, that one included, because then I can give that to somebody who's brand new to reading the Bible and go, oh, they're going to understand. This isn't a category that maybe we still think that tax collectors should be despised today, but we don't want to just assume those things. So, yeah, I'm pretty pro on most of our translations just because they get the text into people's hands. But then how are we going to help people understand those bigger contextual issues? That's where podcasts, study Bible notes. I know in the NIV study Bible, which I was a part of, I was the first woman on that team. That was really fun. And in First Peter, there's a really nice sidebar on the household code of First Peter. I'm like, I'm writing that one. I'm sure we have it in there. And everybody was really great. I mean, Craig Wamberg, Mark Shaw, they're like, yes, please write that. You should be the one to write that. And I wrote it, and I love that sidebar because it says some of the things I've been saying here. Yeah. And it's for anybody who's reading the NIV Study Bible. So it helps you get that context behind there. So
yeah. This is the next question is, how do we interpret it today? And a thought experiment for you, Jeannine, is what if you were just impromptu reading this text, if you were writing it for the Message Bible, something super popular. And the NLT I love as well. It was the first Bible I owned as a new believer in junior high. And I think it was like my favorite food to eat. And even to this day, it just has this place in my life where, it just carried me over through high school, which is, I'm sure, turbulent for everyone. And it just built something inside me as a believer at a young age. And it was accessible, supremely accessible.
Yes. So you were going to ask a question, and I
was going to say, if you were going to just take the passage that Charel read so beautifully, and just put it into this reachable level for everyone. Yeah. Maybe that's too. Maybe you should have had more prep for that one.
I think I should have. But I would want to somehow get in there the backdrop piece. I don't know. So wives, in the same way, submit yourselves to your own husbands. This is, something you've been told to do, nothing new. It's like, it's the expected thing, right? So that if any of them do not believe the word, they might be won over. And this is gonna be really hard because, your husband is, so I would want to give all the explanatory notes, right? Not a translation at all. And you're going to be potentially scared and freaked out about doing this. So you don't have to use any words. Act in a way that they'll be drawn to your soul allegiance to Jesus in a context where that is just not at all acceptable. Because now you can't go to temple with me. Chapter 4, verses 3-4. You've spent enough time doing in the past what pagans choose to do, living in debauchery, lust, drunkenness, orgies, idolatry, detestable idolatry. They are surprised that you do not join them in their reckless, wild living, and they heap abuse on you.
Ooh.
You've pulled away from temple. And so as a wife, you're gonna make that stand, or you're gonna go stand outside the temple and say, I can't go in, I can't go in, I can't go in. And your husband's gonna say, I'll hit you if you don't. And it's like, it's
Right.
That's what I'd want to do. I'd want to imagine,
Right.
Charel, your point about using your imagination to say, what might it look like? And by the way, the really brand new 2023 2-volume First Peter commentary in the International Critical Commentary Series, 2,000 pages long, by Williams and Horrell. They do a great job of imagining some of this. I mean, not quite in colloquial language like that, but they talk about the possible things that a wife could be facing: desertion, physical harm, sexual abuse. I mean, they list some things that could be possible. So she's standing outside the temple and he smacks her because she will not come in. I mean, what is, it's like, I am not home in my own home.
Right.
So trying to put some visuals with it, I would want to do something like that, but that wouldn't be a translation. But it would be a accessible commentary, or an explaining of the stakes, because the stakes are high.
Well, and the stakes are high today too in our own culture, where we have, capitulation to all sorts of moral practices that, people would say, I can't go to that temple. I can't take myself there.
Yeah.
And slander is rife as a consequence. So it's beauty of the Bible. It's very, thank you.
I've always found that when you bring that sort of disciplined imagination to the task of envisioning the text in its context, it's not hard to hear the implications of it for us today. You know what I mean? It's like, oh, wow.
Yeah.
But it's different than maybe what I assumed, because, idolatry it sits behind a lot of New Testament texts in terms of don't go there, right? And don't go there. And what that looks like in our own context, we need to think about that, because we don't have a temple on a hill, but we have other idolatrous practices as a culture. And those are harder to kind of suss out and figure out, how am I going to recognize them and then avoid them? That's just, it's powerful stuff. I think the New Testament helps us with that if we can think about the analogies that are real.
Well, I mean, for people in CBE, the idolatry is male headship often, that this is, truly how you worship God. And so
when you're kind of precluded from being directly in front of God, but have to go through.
Right. And
I grew up in that context where there was an umbrella, I might say.
Oh,
So it was, that's Gothard.
Gothard,
Okay. That took some time and some help from wise people around me, and just from some decisions that I had to make about what I was going to do with my life and the direction I was feeling called to, or led to, or pressed to. So it was pressing. It was like, how do I? So I mean, very real quandaries of, how am I going to follow Jesus? Am I going to follow Jesus? And what does that look like?
And we were very glad you did.
Thank you.
Yeah. And Jeannine, thank you for taking your time to talk to us about this verse and the incredible implications and importance of it. Also, the importance of context, the importance of narrative, imagination, hermeneutics. Do you have any last resources that you can think of that might help some of the viewers, the listeners, maybe a next step. Maybe someone listened to something and they're like, oh, that's cool. Where do I find out some more about that? Do you have any advice on that?
Yeah. So I'll be kind of self-promotional here and say I do have a the book Embedded John's in the New Testament, based on some lectures I gave at Acadia Divinity College in 2022, the Hayward lectures. And so that the lecture on First Peter is about an hour long, and it's available online. And it's sometimes more fun to do that than to read a chapter where I've made it less sort of verbally accessible. Can you take it, kind of smooth out the stuff that actually makes it more interesting to listen to? So I mean, I'd be happy to share that link if we put it on the webpage. That's just a way to kind of get at the household code part of it. But in terms of, books, I mean, I think of I'm sure some of the books you have promoted on your website, Nijay Gupta's book on women in the New Testament. I mean, I think about just some of the more general resources that would be helpful. Karen Job's commentary on First Peter, just really good, and her section on this is really helpful. And it's in second edition, so it's just been refreshed recently, and so that's another resource, kind of different kinds of resources I was thinking of that might help with this First Peter question. I am looking forward to someday publishing in the new Zondervan Biblical Themes series, the First Peter volume, and that's one I just mentioned. And in my chapter on family, I talk about the household codes a bit. They'll show up elsewhere a little bit as well, but that's primarily where I talk about it. So I'm hopeful that that'll be a helpful resource, because I do talk about these questions of application, because there's about 20% of each chapter is about applying or recontextualizing. And so I take on that question of, what does it mean if you don't feel at home in your own home? I mean, I used that little phrase from the song, and think about it in terms of the picture of family that's meant to be a resource for believers across the letter, the family of God, the household of God, which is language he uses in 4:17.
Well, I'd just like to, from my side, like to just thank you. A lot of the academic resources sometimes are like very pay-gated, and it's difficult to buy a commentary. It's difficult to get to some of the articles are behind, a lot of paywalls if you're not a student or something like that. So just from our side, thank you for sharing your own wisdom, your own knowledge, and your own experience, I think, which is also incredibly valuable. I think it's just wonderful that you're open and willing to share this. So thank you so much for that.
I'm really glad to have been here with you.
Yeah, so thank you everyone for joining us. It's been a delight to converse with Jeannine and Charel, and stay tuned for new episodes coming to you weekly from our incredible team of co-hosts. And meanwhile, go to our show notes and learn more about how you can follow our guest, Jeannine Brown, Dr. Jeannine Brown, and links to our organization with books and resources that can help you and those that were mentioned in this interview. Check out our website, www.CBE International, where you can access the world's largest collection on egalitarian content, videos, and audio sessions, and subscribe to our blog, magazine, and academic journal. Visit our bookstore, and just check out our speaker and her content, which I will post in the story notes. So thank you again, everyone. God bless.
Thanks.
Mutuality Matters podcast, along with thousands of CBE's other resources and content, is available for free on CBE's website, which is possible because of donor support. Together, we can spread the message that God calls women and men of all cultures, races, and classes to share authority equally in service and in leadership in the home, church, and world. Give today at cbe.today/donate.